on a lonely planet slowly spinning its way to damnation, amid the incompetence and unpreparedness of lesser space programs, one team stands resilient against the herds, putting their lives on the line to aid those who are previously unaware of the quick-save option. Yes, it's the incredible adventures of Jebediah and his crack team of Kerbals. They are the Blunderbirds, saving the Kerbian race one stranded explorer at a time.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Blunderbirds. It has been quite some time since I did one of these, and that's mainly because I've conducted standard rescue missions to most of the celestial bodies in this game already, that I felt that I didn't really want to do another until an interesting mission presented itself. And this week, well, that's exactly what happened. Poor Reddit user Wavy Iguana attempted to send 36 Kerbals to the Mun using an SSTO spaceplane, but the journey ended in the tragic destruction of the vessel and the stranding of the crew inside this desolate Mun crater. I admired the ambitious nature of the mission. Large crude SSTOs are certainly not an easy feat, and I liked the challenge of having to rescue so many Kerbals, and so the game is on, ladies and gentlemen. I decided to use the carcass of the original craft as a starting point for making my own 36-seat SSTO, that being the Mark III shuttle-style cockpit at the bow of the fuselage, sitting just ahead of two Mark III 16-seater crew cabins to give us a total capacity of 36. Now, while my initial plan was to match the crew capacity of the wrecked SSTO, I realised later on that this probably wouldn't make for great video content, as I would have to send the vessel to the Mun under probe control. And you know, missions, they're not really the same without those little Kerbal faces smiling away in the bottom right hand side of the screen while you launch them on their questionably designed contraptions. And I thought it'd be a shame to not have that for the first half of this video whilst we're getting to the Mun. And so you'll see me swap out one of the nose cones that I put onto this thing for a small crew module to enable us to carry an extra 2 Kerbals, meaning that we can have Valentina and Bill to fly this thing to the Mun. Other than that, the design of this craft follows my fairly standard Argus fuselage setup. I've dubbed it the Engiadine 2 in view of its similarity to the original Engiadine, a 20-seat Mun SSTO I made all the way back in 2015. My goodness, how time flies. I feel like that video might have been the first video I ever made that breached the 100,000 view mark. So, you know, I've got a bit of a nostalgic connection to this kind of SSTO design. And as you can see, construction is proceeding very nicely as we get to adding the landing gear. Now, because I'm attaching landing gear to parts of the ship that sit at various different heights, I like to just drop my space planes down to the floor of the space plane hangar just to make it a little bit easier to make sure that the wheels are actually sitting level relative to each other. Not much else I can think of to really comment. I'm adding some little drogue chutes here to the back just to make the landing look a little bit cooler, although as you will see if you just stay tuned to the very end. See, look at that. Look at that, promoting viewer attention, all that. If you stick around to the very end, you can see that those parachutes actually came in they were pretty useful to have, as it turned out. So that was a good decision when it came to designing this thing. One thing I think might be worth mentioning actually about this craft's landing gear layout is that we've actually got 2 sets of landing gear at the posterior end of the fuselage. We've got the 2 really big sets of landing gear in towards the middle of the fuselage, and then we have the 2 smaller ones on the wingtips just there. And the reason those 2 smaller ones are there are just to help provide stability when we land on the Mun and indeed have to traverse the surface of the Mun. When moving across uneven terrain, this thing will have a bit of a tendency to wobble because of the high mass of those peripherally mounted rapier units. So like I say, to help ensure that we remain stable and don't tip over, we've got those wing-mounted landing gear. Those will be stowed away though when we take off from Kerbin, just because if they are deployed, the nose won't be able to lift up because those landing gear will prevent it from pitching up. They're sitting far too far behind the vessel's center of mass, so they're going to be stowed away, and that's why the bigger landing gear towards the center of the fuselage is sitting a little bit further forward. It's sitting only just behind the center of mass, such that it will act as a nice fulcrum to allow the elevators to lift the craft into the air before we get to the end of the runway. I mean, like I say, it's not really that necessary because you can just use the end of the runway as a kind of ramp to start getting airborne without needing to worry about landing gear placements, but I think it's a bit more realistic, and it adds a slightly, a little bit of a fun, dynamic challenge to designing crafts to make sure you can see if you can pitch up before you reach the end of the runway. And we're about to see that's about to be put to the test as we fire up those Rapier engines and begin our acceleration to take off speed, which is going to be about between 90 and 100 meters per second is when I start pitching up this sort of craft. It's very big, as you can imagine. It needs to be going at a fair old pace before you can start getting into the air without risking, jeopardizing your stability. And look at that. We have a textbook launch from the runway surface. We've got a lot of runway left, actually, so we needn't have worried about running out of tarmac before this thing got into the air. And speaking of getting into the air, we're going to now begin our ascent. I don't know what that was. I like to think I try and come up with clever segues, but they're really not. If anything, they're obnoxious. But moving along regardless, the first stage of our ascent is to pick up as much speed as we can in the lower atmosphere. We really want to reach the sweet spot speed of about 440 meters per second, which is when the Rapiers unlock their full potential and start providing a lot more thrust to help us blast our way to orbital velocity. I like doing this earlier on because there's a lot more air for the engines to suck in and fuel themselves, or at least supplement the liquid fuel. For those pedantic people out there, you know what I mean. We can pick up as much speed as possible more easily in the lower atmosphere, and then once we start picking up a good pace, I sort of held a pitch at about 10 degrees on the nav wall because I felt this was a good compromise between continuing our acceleration whilst also ascending through the air. I like trying to find a little bit of a balance there, and I think we met one quite well. So once we reach 10 kilometers, which will be happening imminently, I'm going to start flattening out my trajectory because this is where we're going to try and pick up as much speed as we possibly can. This is kind of the sweet point, between 10 and 20 kilometers, where the air is quite thin, so there's not as much air resistance as there would be lower down in the atmosphere, but there is also enough air for the Rapiers to continue burning at fairly high thrust levels without needing to use the ship's oxidizer, which is a much more inefficient way of burning. But eventually we're going to need to start thinking about pushing our way beyond the limits of air-breathing engines. So at 20 kilometers, as you can see, I fired up the nuclear engines, which will help provide a little bit of thrust. And then once we stop accelerating or even begin decelerating, I'm going to hit action group 2. That fires up the closed cycle mode of the Rapiers, and they're going to carry us the rest of the way to orbit. And that's pretty much our ascent. Don't think there's much more I really need to comment on whilst we continue our closed cycle burn. I really liked flying this SSTO, actually. It's a very forgiving ship. I feel like if you've never flown an SSTO before, you might struggle. If you'd like to give it a go, though, there is a craft file in the description. But, if you're somewhat familiar with SSTOs, but still not that great, I think this is quite a forgiving ship. It has more delta V than you really need for this particular mission. I think I ended up with a kilometer meters per second. Brilliant. Over 1,000 meters per second of delta V remaining when we landed back at the Kerbals Space Center's runway. So easily enough to do a MUN mission without much room for error. With a lot of room for error, I should say. My goodness, another verbal typo. Guys, you're going to have to bear with me, this commentary. It's about 7 p.m. on a Friday. I've just got back from work on a 9-hour shift in the hospital. It's very warm. I got the sun shining in my eyes in my office. And my computer, it's generated a lot of heat. So we're going to struggle through this commentary together, guys, but I'm going to try and make it to the very end. Before this SSTO can get anywhere, though, we need to ensure that we enter a stable Kerbin orbit. So I'm just planning out the circularization burn here, and then we can get underway. Now, you might notice that the in-game delta V readouts can be a bit squiffy because everything is all mushed together into one stage. We've got a variety of air-breathing engines, really inefficient, chemical rocket engines in the form of the closed cycle Rapiers, and of course we have the nuclear engines which only use liquid fuel, and they have a completely different ISP again. Sometimes the game freaks out a little bit, so if you want a more accurate delta V readout, you can see I finally reinstalled Kerbal Engineer Redux, and that's sitting on the top left. So you got the time warp hub that comes with the stock game on the far top left, then kind of to the right of that, you've got the Kerbal Engineer. Bottom of that, I don't know why I'm giving you so much detail on where to find it. It's pretty obvious. It just says Delta V remaining. I think I'm squinting. It's not the best quality preview I'm watching here. And speaking of things that were low quality, my timing of maneuver node burns was not great. Oh, look at that. It's a beautiful eclipse. Isn't that nice? Let that distract you from what's about to happen. Yes, I foolishly relied on the in-game when to burn indicator when performing my Kerbin to Mun transfer burn. As you can see, it recommended I start my burn about 2 minutes from the maneuver node, which, as it turns out, my burn is going to be excessively long. I really should have started the burn a bit before that point. So I'm like, okay, let's just do it and see how far we get. But we ended up going quite a bit past the initial maneuver node. I'm like, you know what? This is not going to be an accurate burn now. So let's just stop. We'll plot another one. And I can kind of disguise this because this is a more efficient way of doing burns from Kerbin to the Mun, especially with a craft with as lower thrust to weight ratio as this one. So maybe I shouldn't have dressed this as I made a mistake and just said this is what I intended to do all along. But I have to be honest with you guys, I'm trying to be an honest person and I didn't really mean to do this. But like I said, I didn't really need to be worried about saving Delta V and being hyper efficient with this particular mission because, as mentioned, we finished this entire mission with like 1,000 meters per second of Delta V remaining. I really hope I'm correct on that, because if I'm wrong, I'm going to look rather silly. But here we are, performing our second burn to get us all the way to the Mun. And, well, that's that there. We've got a beautiful little view of Kerbin's clouds. People keep asking me what visual mods I use, and I don't know, I kind of stopped putting them in the description because it didn't... When I started putting my mod list in the description, I hoped that people would stop asking me what mods I use, but they didn't change at all. I got the same number of messages. I'm like, okay, whatever. It's a lot of effort to keep on updating the mod list in the description because I change my mods quite frequently, so... if you want to know what visual mods I use, I basically just Google Kerbal Space Program visual mod and then just click the top result and install that. I think I'm using, usually it's Scatterer. You got to use Scatterer. Environmental Visual Enhancements is usually the other one as well that you have. After that, you can use whatever shaders you want. I think at the moment I'm using Scatterer, Environmental Visual Enhancement, and Astronomer's Visual Pack, I think. Not sure though. Just find a pack that you like, and it doesn't have to look like mine. And that's all I have to say about that. And no, we do not have a ground enhancement shader for the surface of the Mun, despite it looking so beautiful. And that's because, of course, we are playing with the... I guess it's not really new. I keep thinking of this as a new feature of Kerbal Space Program, but I guess it's not. I guess I just don't go to the Mun very often anymore. But no, I still can't get over how beautiful the new planet textures look. So yeah, this is the ultra setting for the Mun surface. I got confused just then because I looked back at the screen and saw the crashed vessel. I'm like, oh, did I put the wrong footage here? But no, I remember now. I switched to the ground vessel just because it's a little bit easier to see where it is relative to the orbiting vessel. I wanted to just time warp around until it was at a point where it was underneath the rescue SSTO's orbital line, which it is, so we can begin our de-orbit burn. Now, I begin by dropping our periapsis into the Mun, as in, inside, getting rid of the periapsis effectively, shifting our inclination to place us on a heading that takes us over the target. Normally, once this step is complete, usually if you're using a rocket with good TWR, it's fairly simple to follow the descent path and perform a retrograde burn once over the target. However, things are slightly trickier here. Firstly, we only have 4 nuclear engines, which provide a pitiful amount of thrust, so our landing burn is going to be very long, making it harder to predict exactly where we're going to end up. Secondly, the terrain here is far from ideal. The SSTO wreckage is at the base of a very steep crater with a rather tall and jagged rim, so we need to ensure that our vertical speed remains as low as possible during our descent. You can see that on the right-hand HUD of Kerbal Engineer Redux, just to ensure that we don't drop down too soon. The objective here is to try and kill velocity, as in try and kill horizontal velocity only. This can be achieved by burning at an angle, like so. This video isn't really a textbook example, as I ended up undershooting the target a little bit, and in my haste to make a corrective maneuver, I ended up dropping down too fast, and I had to use some of my oxidizer reserves to fire the Rapier engines to quickly prevent surface impact. But hey, that's a benefit of saving some oxidizer after you perform your Kerbin Ascent, just in case of situations like that, where it's useful to just be able to have a sudden kick of thrust. And now, for example, I messed up a little bit here. as well. So, this is a far from perfect execution, so I guess that makes it more relatable. That's the excuse and the reasoning I'm going with. Now, one benefit of the wreckage's location is that because it's at the base of this crater, all we really needed to do was land anywhere on one of the crater's slopes, and from there, we can just use gravity to roll down to the target's location, which we can just do that now. Now, when it comes to the subject of steering space planes over celestial surfaces such as that was a fun sentence, wasn't it? When it came to steering this thing across the Mun surface, it didn't really want to turn very well. So to help facilitate our maneuverability, you can see I kind of fired each side of the nuclear engine cluster to kind of help push us in the right direction, and it helped a bit. I do feel like in older versions of the game it was much easier to steer craft like this. I may just be misremembering, and that was never the case, but I just feel like it was easier at one point. Although then I do have to bear in mind that this thing is a very large craft, so maybe just craft of this size were always this cumbersome. Who knows? Now we need to board the Kerbals onto the craft. Although that being said, we haven't yet done the most important part of any Kerbal Space Program mission, and that is, of course, to plant the Blunderbirds flag. So once the first Kerbal has board, maybe she was just like really, really eager. She was getting a bit mad. She just had to get on board before Valentina could go out and do a quick inspection of the crew. So she's just doing a quick flyover, making sure they're all there, doing a quick head count. Yes, there are 35 crew members still remaining. She can then go ahead and plant the all-important Blunderbirds flag. You may have noticed that the Engiadine 2 spaceplane is covered in Engiadine 2, text, and that's because that's the new flag pieces in Kerbal Space Program 1.10. And as you know, if you watched my KSP 1.10 preview video, you know that you can actually have them be different to the mission flag. In previous, versions of KSP, I liked to have the nameplate of my SSTOs on the side of the cockpit, but then that meant that the actual mission's flag was compromised. That also had to be the nameplate. Not anymore. Now we can have nameplates on spaceplanes and still have our Blunderbirds flag. Now, for the boarding of the rest of the Kerbals, I first of all filmed the whole thing and time-lapsed it, but I realized that it was just incredibly difficult to watch the time-lapse because it was so sped up. I was genuinely worried it might have caused epileptic seizures for people, so I decided to not show a big time-lapse of all the Kerbals boarding the craft. If I'd slowed the time-lapse speed down any further, it would have just taken an insufferable amount of time. The real-time portion of this part of the mission was probably about 25-30 minutes. I remember watching a couple of lengthy YouTube videos on my computer's second monitor to pass the time whilst I did that mind-numbingly boring exercise, so I thought I'd spare you the boredom of that. And now we can begin our takeoff. Craters are pretty good places for launching space planes such as this, as we can use the terrain to form a natural ramp to kick us upward and begin raising our apoapsis. But to help facilitate this, you may have noticed I'd installed 4 Werner engines, and to be honest, 4 is overkill, 1 or 2 is fine, to ensure that our nose cone stayed upward as we ascended. You may have noticed a bit of a cheeky edit just there looking at the screen. I messed up my first ascent attempt as I didn't anticipate this really large mountain range and canyon. To the right of your screen, you'll be seeing it in just a second. I typically conduct my Mun ascents by following the prograde marker, but in this case, it meant I didn't increase my altitude quickly enough, and it sent me smacking into the side of that mountain face. Not good. That's why for the first part of this ascent, I held a fairly steeper than usual angle of attack on the nav ball. And we're seeing that canyon looming into view very soon. It's that thing. There's the canyon there. It's this mountain. It doesn't look that big, actually, now I see it again. But at the time, I was just continually smacking into the side of it. People are going to probably take sound bites of certain aspects of that sentence. I do not appreciate being taken out of context. Thank you very much. But now we're clear of that final hazard. We're pretty much homeward bound. Now, I thought we'd do some air brakes to, I don't even know if we have enough fuel actually to lower our... I think we might just have enough Delta V left to not need to do air brakes, but I didn't want to take that chance. I didn't plan out maneuver nodes to check, so I genuinely don't know, but I thought let's not take that chance. Once we've escaped from the Mun sphere of influence, we're going to be lowering our apoapsis around Kerbin by doing a series of aero brakes. And, they'll be fairly safe. They're going to be at fairly high altitudes to ensure that we're definitely not going to explode, overheat, all that shebang. Literally, because whatever. To ensure that we did remain at a safe altitude, it meant that we had to do a few aero brakes. I couldn't just do one aero brake and be done, because that would have been a bit risky. Didn't want to risk it for a biscuit, so we're going to do a couple. I don't know, guys. It's getting late. I need to get this commentary done. So we're gonna do a few aero brakes, and you're gonna watch them, and you're gonna enjoy them. All right. So here is the first one. I'm sorry, I didn't want to shout at you guys. I think it's just a reflect. Anyway, I can talk about something here actually. So when I perform each aero brake, you can see I deactivate SAS and then just time warp around, and then just before we enter the atmosphere again, I can quickly toggle SAS back on. The reason I'm turning off SAS when I'm doing that time warp around Kerbin to get back to the atmospheric border is because otherwise our electric charge would just run out whilst we were doing that time warp around. You can see it eventually did run out, but it meant that we could do quite a few air brakes without needing to do the very slow process of opening up the solar panels, making sure they're exposed to the sun and staying out in sunlight exposure for long enough that the batteries can recharge, because if you just time warp around really quick, sometimes that doesn't happen. So that's kind of that's why I was deactivating SAS. During those periods of time warp, we have nearly completed all of our aero brakes, though. We're going to do a kind of final burn to get ourselves on a course to the Kerbal Space Center's runway. Sometimes, once in the blue moon, I don't have to do that, and it just so happens that I line up all my aero brakes in such a way that we can just go straight for the KSC without needing to do any orbital burns. This was not the case. However, I was a bit concerned that I had done so many aero brakes at this point, and I knew the video was going to be fairly long anyway. I mean, we're at 22 minutes just over now, so I'm like, let's just try and get it done quickly. So I'm like, where is the Kerbal Space Center? Let's just do our deorbit burn now. And it turns out it was pretty much right in front of us, so I had to do a fairly big and inefficient burn, but as I said, I had lots of Delta V remaining, so it was fine. To do a somewhat questionable in terms of its safety re-entry just here. It's going to be a very steep re-entry path. I was a bit concerned, actually, that as soon as I entered the atmosphere, I was like, oh, hang on, is this going to be safe? We might explode. Luckily, nothing did overheat, and we are playing at normal re-entry heating, so no bamboozle here, guys, do not worry. But I guess it must have been fairly close. I generally play without temperature gauges visible because I think it looks bad for a video. But we did it. We're going to be coming in very, very quick though. So I first of all decided to quickly pause the game and add our drogue chutes to an action group, just to make it easier to deploy them once we touched down on the runway, because I figured, we're coming in very, very fast. We're not going to have much space left on the runway to fully slow down. So as you can see, I'm like over the runway now, and we're still going at ludicrous speed. So I did a few sort of undulations in the air to try and kill off a bit of horizontal velocity. And then we touched it down, deployed the parachutes, and I was like, oh, can we make it? Oh, they're already on maximum breakage. Those brakes there, but it was fine. The Kerbals, they've been stuck on the Mun so long, they've probably been bored out of their minds. I thought it might be nice to add a bit of excitement and have a dangerous landing sequence. And that is, was there a moral to that story? I don't know. But what I do know is that it's the end of the video, which means there is an end screen, and on the left-hand side is a video chosen for you by YouTube's recommendation algorithm based on your viewing habits. The one on the right is just my most recent upload. There's also a link to subscribe and check out Patreon if you would like to. The description, you will find links to Twitter, Discord, Instagram, merchandise, all that good stuff. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.